Laborna bore the grand title of Magister Mimeriorum, which means the master of the mimes. He was responsible for a group of comedians who came from all the corners of the empire. There were jugglers from Greece who could hold 6, 7, 8 burning torches in the air at once. They had dancers from Syria with their haunting tunes and their colorful dresses. And there were acrobats from the island of Crete with their oily skins and their dark hair braided, and they could jump over a racing bull, and they could twist their bodies in all kinds of weird shapes. And there were snake charmers from Egypt with their snakes glistening like emeralds as they coiled out of their baskets. There were strong men from the north, blonde and blue-eyed, and they could lift an ox with one hand. It was a marvelous group of people. And they worked on the streets of the mighty city of Rome. They entertained people on the marketplace, on the squares, on the street corners, and people would throw them copper coins for their art, for their entertainment. Most of them were slaves, saving up those copper coins one by one to buy their freedom from their masters. And some of them had already bought their freedom, but they kept working as comedians because that was the only thing that they knew. And Laborna was the master who oversaw all this group of people, a former slave himself. Well, one day, disturbing news started to arrive to the city of Rome. The barbarians were coming. The Huns were on the move from the east down, from the north of Italy, burning cities as they went. Aquileia fell, Vicenza fell, Padua fell, and they were coming closer and closer to the city of Rome for its treasures. The people of Rome decided to close the gates to protect themselves from the barbarians, and there were already rumors going around about how the barbarians were cruel and vicious, and they would eat people alive. But when most people saw danger, Laborna and his comedians saw an opportunity. We can't go to the barbarians, said one of the Greek jugglers. They would shoot us before we get close enough to the camp. They can shoot those arrows farther away than any other archer in the empire. And if they don't shoot us, they would capture us and we would be slaves again, or they would eat us alive. Those barbarians do that. They eat raw flesh and they sleep on horseback and they live in tents and they cook over campfires. They have no idea about civilized entertainment. Why would we go to that camp? Laborna looked into his cup of wine and he said, "Don't think about the arrows. Think about the gold. Those barbarians are being paid by the Greeks, so they would attack us instead of them. They wear all their treasures on their person. You can go to their camp and you can see men wearing bracelets and necklaces and belts made of solid gold and silver and gemstones. Throwing us golden coins would be nothing to them. It would be like the copper coins here in the city. And they have never seen civilized entertainment. They would treasure us. We would be something exciting. And they would pay us our weight in gold." And they talked and talked all night, the debate going back and forth between safety and treasures. And finally, in the morning, they decided to go to the barbarian camp. The city of Rome was sending an envoy to Attila the Hun to talk about peace. And leading the envoy was the Pope himself. And he was traveling with all these soldiers and all these servants. And Laborna and his comedians joined this trail of people traveling up north to meet the Huns. The first thing they saw about the Huns was the smoke from their campfires, even before they could see the camp itself. And just from the smoke, they could tell that this army was bigger than any army Rome had ever had to face. And as they got closer, they could make out the tents, which were not the organized rows of military tents of the Roman army. These were tents scattered all over the place. And in between the tents, there were campfires with women cooking and children running around bare feet and men on horseback. And they realized that this was not a military camp. This was a nation on the move. Leborna and his comedians walked into the camp, and people started gathering around them, looking at their strange clothes and their strange faces, and staring at them with curiosity that mirrored their own. And as they walked among the tents, the crowd got larger and larger, following them around until there was no way to turn and continue walking. So they just stopped in a clear space in between tents, and they set up for their performance. And the crowd gathered in a circle, and they watched, and they murmured in their strange language among each other as the jugglers started to juggle and the dancers started to dance. And Leborna was keeping an eye on the comedians, but he was also watching the Huns all around, women and children and men looking over the head of the crowd from their horses. And he saw this one young boy standing in the front row, his eyes large with wonder. He had truly never seen anything like this before. And as he watched, the boy turned and he wove his way in between people in the crowd and disappeared. A few minutes later, as Leborna looked around again, the boy came back, the crowd parting to let him through. And holding the boy's hand was an older man. The boy stopped at the edge of the circle, leaning in as if he was about to step into the circle with the comedians. But the man just stopped right there and looked. His long hair braided, his beard cropped short, his eyes dark and deep, and his face unreadable. He was wearing all the colors of the autumn leaves, but not a single piece of gold on his person. And even though he looked like that, as Leborna looked around again, he could see the people in the crowd one by one turning away from the spectacle and looking at that man. And he finally realized that they were in the presence of royalty. So he walked around and tapped all the performers on the shoulder one by one. And they all turned towards the man, and they knelt, and they touched their foreheads to the ground. And even though they were doing that, Leborna was thinking, is that really him? Is that the scourge of God? Is that Attila the Hun himself? Is that the king of the barbarians? No gold, no silver, no jewels. He doesn't look like a king at all. But still there was something in the man's presence that made it clear who he was. And as he looked at the comedians, he held out his hand. And somebody brought a bow, one of those vicious double-curved bows that the Huns used and they were famous for. And Attila took an arrow, put it on the string, pulled the bow all the way back to his high cheekbones, and aimed at something in the sky, and then he let the arrow fly. And the arrow flew up and up and up, and when it almost disappeared in the sky, it struck something, and then it fell down and down and down and down. And somebody ran to retrieve it and came back and lay a bird at Attila's feet, and the bird was hit with the arrow straight through the heart. Attila took the bow and another arrow and handed it to Leborna, motioning to him to do it. Leborna put the arrow on the string even though he had never shot a bow and arrow before. He put the arrow on the string and he tried and he tried and he tried, but he couldn't even pull the string back enough to shoot the arrow. So his cheeks burning in shame, he handed the bow and arrow to the strongest man in the company. And that man put the arrow on the string and he pulled and he pulled and he pulled and could not pull the string back enough to shoot the arrow. So the comedians handed the bow all around, and each one of them tried to shoot the arrow, but nobody was strong enough. So finally, they took the bow and they handed it back to Attila. And he looked at them for a very long moment. And then in perfect Latin, so they could understand, he said, "You will stay in my camp until you can shoot that arrow like I did. And until then, you are not allowed to eat anything but what you have hunted for yourself." And then he turned around and he left, followed by the young boy. And people were murmuring all around them, and the comedians realized that they were stuck in the Huns' camp. And then the children started coming, because the Huns already knew that these comedians were not going to use the bows and arrows that they used in battle. So they let the children show up with their tiny little bows and arrows for practice. And those were the only weapons the comedians were strong enough to use. So they started practicing with the children, who could ride a horse before they could walk, and who could shoot an arrow before they could speak. And they practiced day by day. And at first, they could not shoot anything, and they were just getting skinnier and skinnier and hungrier and hungrier. So the day, a week later, when Laburna first shot a rabbit, felt like the biggest celebration they had ever had in their life. After that, things were starting to get better. Little by little, they got better at shooting. Their arms were growing stronger. And when they were good enough with bow and arrow to hit the target 3 times in a row, the children started to teach them how to ride a horse without a saddle, without stirrups, without using their hands, so their hands would be free to shoot from horseback, as the Huns did. And little by little, they were getting better and better at that. But that was not the only thing that they were learning. Spending time in the Huns' camp taught them a lot of other things. They started to understand bits and pieces of that strange language that the Huns were speaking among themselves. They started learning their songs that the women hummed while they were cooking over the campfires. They started learning that strange code of honor that the Hun warriors had. They started learning about Attila himself. Sometimes when they were practicing with the children, the young boy would show up, and they learned that his name was Csaba, and he was the youngest son of Attila and the most beloved. Which sounded strange, because kings usually treasured the oldest son, the one that was going to follow them on the throne. But there were rumors in the Hun camp that Attila preferred his youngest, and he wanted to leave his throne to him. And that just sounded strange to the Romans. So they asked around and they asked people why Attila liked that son so much. And the Huns told them a story. They said, there is a prophecy that when Attila dies, his empire will die with him. And it will fall apart and disappear just like so many other empires before that. But there's a prophecy that that boy will be responsible for keeping the spirit of the Huns alive. And that is why Attila treasures him so much. And that is why Attila has only ever been seen smiling when he looked at that boy. And they learned other things about the king of the Huns too, the barbarian that everybody feared in the Roman Empire. He grew up Roman. He was a hostage when he was little. His father sent him to Rome to learn the Roman ways. So when he became the king of the Huns, he would know the enemy. That is why he spoke perfect Latin. He also spoke Greek. And he was always the most simple person in the camp, not a piece of gold or silver, but he had that presence that made even the strongest and the bravest warriors bow down to him. That was the presence that made all the defeated tribes, all the defeated German peoples to join the Huns' army and follow him into battle. Weeks passed. Negotiations were still going on between the Pope, the Romans, and Attila and the Huns. And Laburna and his comedians were getting better and better at fighting. And they learned something else in the camp. As they were getting better and better, and they learned to shoot, and they learned to hunt, and they learned to ride a horse, they felt respected. All those people in the camp treated them as equals, treated them as warriors, and not just slaves who were performing on the street corners by throwing them copper coins. They were called by their names, and they were joined at the hunt, and they were not left out of the festivities. Weeks and weeks later, Leborna decided that they were ready to show Attila the Hun what they had learned. So they lined up in front of the huge tent that was called Attila's castle. And the king of the Huns stepped out of his tent holding a simple cup of mare's milk in his hand, and he looked at the comedians and he nodded. So one by one they raised their bows and arrows, and they aimed at birds in the sky, and they shot their arrows, and one by one they laid the birds at Attila's feet. And when Leborna, as the last one in the line, placed the prey at the feet of the king, Attila nodded, and then he said, "You are free to go." The Huns never attacked the city of Rome. There are several legends about why not. Some people say that the Pope paid them chests and chests of gold and silver to keep them away from the city. Some legends say that there was a drought, and Attila knew that he would not be able to sustain his army in Italy anymore, and he had to go back home. Some legends say that he was superstitious because he knew that all the barbarian kings who had attacked Rome before perished in great pain and agony. Some legends say that the moment he talked to the Pope, he saw the image of the Virgin Mary floating above the Pope's head, and he knew that something strong was protecting this city. We will never know the truth of why he did not attack Rome and he was so close to the gates. But the story does tell us that when the Hun camp packed up and turned around and left to go back to the east, Leborna and the comedians were traveling with them. Thank you.